You were never meant to know this. That's not a dramatic statement, it's historical fact. In the winter of 1847, 7 physicians, all trained at Harvard, collectively agreed to burn a patient's records, not because they were incomplete, not because they were fabricated, but because what they witnessed inside that small hospital in Millbrook, Massachusetts, shattered something inside them that medicine could never put back together. 3 of those doctors vanished from the profession within months. The others were forbidden to speak of her name again. Only one man, Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, defied the silence, and he did it the only way he could, by writing it down, page by page, line by line, in a leather-bound journal he hid in the floorboards of his attic. That journal was found 117 years later by his great-grandson, who had been renovating the house. What he found inside has been sealed and buried twice since then. But today it's being unearthed again, and once you hear it, you will never look at the past, or yourself, the same way again. It began on January the 15th, 1847, when a young woman was found unconscious in a barn on the outskirts of Millbrook. No coat, no shoes, no memory. Just a thin cotton dress, a pouch of silver coins, and a brass locket with no inscription. Her name was Latoya. That's all she gave. Nothing more. She was brought to Blessed Mercy Infirmary, the most advanced hospital in that corner of New England, a place run by Protestant ministers who believed healing the body required purifying the soul. It was a cold, stern place, steepled and brick-walled, laced with scripture, soaked in the odor of carbolic acid and coal smoke, a place where pain was treated with leeches and prayer, where the mind was seen not as biology but morality. Her arrival disrupted everything. Dr. Aldrich's first notes describe her as physically healthy, no fever, no frostbite, no signs of trauma, but her behavior, that was something else. She spoke only when spoken to. She answered with clarity, but no warmth. Her eyes, he wrote, scanned the room like they were reading what hadn't yet occurred. She flinched at crosses, stiffened at the Lord's Prayer, and when asked about her faith, she began whispering in a language no one could place. Not Latin, not Greek, not even among the obscure Caribbean tongues studied by Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest physician at the hospital. It is a tongue without borders, Brennan wrote, not gibberish, but architecture, words with weight. That first night, the atmosphere in the infirmary changed. The oil lamps burned lower, the air thickened, and nurses, hardened women of faith and medicine, began requesting reassignment away from her room. One nun reported hearing her murmur in her sleep, not words, names of dead husbands, dead children, dead secrets. That's when the visions began. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before she rewrote the rules of medicine and faith, before patients began dreaming of lives they never lived, before a Protestant reverend said she bore knowledge that no Christian soul should carry, Latoya sat in a narrow bed, hands folded, head bowed, and said something no one could explain. I remember being young, but I also remember being old. And if that doesn't terrify you yet, you're not listening closely enough. Dr. Aldrich had seen his share of madness, hysteria, melancholia, catatonia that left men frozen for weeks like statues of flesh. But Latoya didn't fit into any known category. She responded to his questions with surgical precision. She slept soundly, ate normally. Her pulse was strong, her body calm, but it was her presence that disrupted everything, like a tuning fork struck in a quiet room, setting off vibrations no one could trace, but everyone could feel. Patients near her bed began reporting vivid dreams, not just images, experiences. One man claimed he remembered a childhood he never had. A woman described reliving a conversation with her deceased father in such detail, she wept for hours. At first, Dr. Aldrich considered mass hysteria, a kind of group delusion, but the patterns were too specific, too synchronized. The first undeniable break came on the night of January 18th. Dr. Aldrich, conducting his final rounds, passed by Latoya's room and saw her sitting upright, eyes closed, whispering in that unknown language. But this time, her voice wasn't soft. It echoed, carried, as if spoken into a cathedral. Patients across the ward stirred, moaned. A few cried out. One man, Thomas Brewster, began weeping silently. When questioned later, Brewster described a vision, a firelit ceremony in a tropical jungle, masked figures dancing, chanting words he didn't understand but somehow knew. He said it felt like a memory, not his own, but inherited. Something ancient, something buried in the blood. And that was the pattern. Latoya didn't just unsettle people, she unlocked them. Dr. Aldrich documented it all in his private journal. She affects the minds of others with no direct interaction, he wrote. Dreams, visions, emotional outbursts. I do not believe this is malingering or contagion of the mind. I believe she is a transmitter, a vessel. What haunted him most were the coincidences. The rat infestation that plagued the hospital since autumn vanished within days of Latoya's arrival. The furnace, which had failed repeatedly, suddenly functioned without repair, and nurses began reporting that daily routines, bloodletting, bandaging, scripture, seemed to unfold with uncanny smoothness. But only when Latoya was calm. Then there were the disruptions. Sister Mary Catherine, who had spent 22 years serving the ill and dying, confessed to Aldrich that she had begun hearing Latoya in her dreams, not speaking, singing, a low, rhythmic hum that felt both mournful and seductive. She woke each time soaked in sweat, heart pounding. But the next morning, her patient, a child dying of typhoid, had shown inexplicable signs of recovery. She is not evil, the sister said, but she is not ours. Not everyone agreed. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, the hospital's founder and spiritual overseer, insisted that what they were witnessing was not divine mystery, but spiritual contamination. On January 20th, he requested a private audience with Latoya. Witnesses recall the chapel door closed for 57 minutes. When the Reverend emerged, his hands were shaking, his face pale. He said only this: that woman knows things no Christian should know. She names what has no name. Burn your journals, doctor. Burn them all. Dr. Aldrich didn't listen, and that decision would unravel everything. February arrived like a blade. The snow outside the Blessed Mercy Infirmary turned to jagged sheets of ice, trapping most of the staff indoors for days at a time. Inside, the atmosphere thickened, not with smoke, but with tension. Something unspoken coiled itself around the hospital's halls, tightening with each passing hour. Latoya hadn't had a single fever, not a single wound. But the hospital itself had become her patient. It pulsed with her mood. When she wept, lights flickered. When she smiled, the air seemed warmer. The orderlies stopped using the term "the girl." They started calling her the anchor, like a force that tethered them all to something none of them could name. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest physician on staff, was the first to break protocol. Obsessed with her strange dialect, he had begun reading every linguistic record he could find at the Salem Historical Society. What he uncovered rattled him. In the manifest of a wrecked slave ship from 1823, the Esperanza, he found a record of a girl, 4 years old, listed only as Latoya. One of the survivors had been described as speaking tongues unknown to Christian ears and possessing spiritual knowledge of unnatural origins. That child, Brennan realized, would be 28 now. But Latoya appeared no older than 22. She had no accent, no scars, no memory of her past, until Brennan confronted her with the name Esperanza. What followed was not a conversation. It was an eruption. Latoya stood from her bed and began speaking rapidly in the same eerie language as before, except this time she didn't close her eyes. She looked through Brennan as if reading his spine like scripture. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands clutched the brass locket that she always kept hidden beneath her pillow. For the first time she spoke of her childhood, not in linear memories, but in fragments, images. The Feel of chains on her skin, salt water in her mouth, firelight and drums in a forest, voices that didn't speak, they sang through her bones. "I don't age the way others do," she whispered to Dr. Aldrich later that night. "Time moves differently for those who carry memory, not as thought, but as blood. I remember dying, I remember being born, and sometimes they happen at the same time." Dr. Aldrich tried to rationalize it as trauma-induced memory distortion, a textbook defense. But that defense began to fall apart when Latoya described events from the hospital's own past, including details of patients who had died before she was admitted. Names, symptoms, words spoken to loved ones on their final night. She recounted them with chilling clarity. Nurses began requesting reassignment away from her wing. Others begged to be moved closer. Some patients claimed her presence cured them. Others claimed she summoned their worst regrets in dreams so vivid they began speaking in voices that were not their own. One woman, previously mute for 7 years, began reciting a funeral chant from West Africa, word for word. She collapsed minutes later and died. Latoya never touched her, just stood nearby, humming. By mid-February, Dr. Aldrich was no longer asking if she was dangerous. He was asking, to whom? "And now I want you to do something that the hospitals, the churches, the entire medical establishment never wanted you to do. I want you to comment below these exact words twice. I remember what they tried to erase. Write it once for yourself, and once for those who were silenced before you. You'll feel it click. That shift inside you. The descent has begun. The ministers arrived in silence. 3 men of the cloth, Whitmore, Blackwood, Marsh, dressed in their darkest vestments, carrying worn Bibles, fear behind their eyes, and something heavier on their backs. Guilt, knowledge, or perhaps both. Their presence in the infirmary was not just a spiritual formality, it was containment. They had heard too much. This was no ordinary patient. Latoya didn't speak during their arrival. She didn't move. She simply sat, upright, hands folded, as if waiting for judgment. Her face was calm, but her presence made the chapel feel smaller. Reverend Marsh, the oldest of the 3, claimed the air near her seat made his lungs burn. Reverend Blackwood said he heard humming, but only inside his head. Reverend Whitmore, who had first sat with her weeks earlier, refused to make eye contact. They weren't there to offer faith. They were there to evaluate threat. That night, under candlelight, the observation began. Latoya was kept in the prayer room while patients were escorted in one by one. No medications, no suggestion, just contact. The first was a blind woman named Edith Raines, 63, recovering from typhoid. As she entered the chapel, she stopped walking. "She's humming," she whispered, but not with her mouth. Latoya didn't move. She hadn't made a sound. Edith wept without reason and collapsed at Latoya's feet, muttering fragments of a childhood memory she had never told anyone. Her father's death in a mine collapse in Pennsylvania, 1799. The next patient was a young Catholic boy, age 9, admitted after a farm injury. He approached Latoya cautiously, clutching a rosary. She smiled, just faintly, and he gasped. He said she looked like a girl who visited his dreams to tie the wind together, and told him he would walk again. The most chilling case came later that night. A man named Elijah Moore, F., former theology professor turned alcoholic, had been comatose for nearly a month. On a whim, Dr. Brennan ordered him wheeled in. Latoya's reaction was immediate. She walked, barefoot, to his stretcher and placed her hand on his chest. Elijah spoke, not in English, not in Latin, in her dialect, the same untraceable language. His eyes remained shut, but he kept repeating the same 3 words over and over again, words even Latoya seemed disturbed by. She pulled back. Elijah began to seize. His body convulsed for 40 seconds before stopping cold. He died with a smile. Reverend Blackwood couldn't sleep for days afterward. In his journal he wrote, "We are not witnessing possession. This is no demon, no trick of the devil. What we are witnessing is something far more ancient, something that predates our notions of good and evil. She does not belong to the Church's categories. She unmakes them. Dr. Aldrich tried to keep the sessions private, but rumors leaked. Patients in other wings began chanting at night, fragments of her language. One nun, Sister Agnes, locked herself in the laundry room and carved symbols into the wall, claiming they came from Latoya's songs. When questioned, she couldn't translate a single one. The hospital began splitting in two, not physically, but in loyalty. There were those who believed Latoya was a conduit for healing, and those who believed she was a walking contagion of memory and madness. But both sides agreed on one thing. She was not simply a girl. She was an event, a reckoning in a cotton dress, and she was just beginning to remember who she really was. By the second week of joint observation, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary no longer resembled a place of healing. It had become a place of revelation and unraveling. The staff moved like shadows, whispering prayers in unused hallways, avoiding Latoya's room like it emitted smoke. Even the brick walls seemed to groan more often, as if the building itself had begun to strain under the weight of whatever Latoya carried inside her. The ministers took shifts now. They claimed it was to provide constant spiritual vigilance, but in truth, none of them wanted to be alone with her. Dr. Aldrich, still clinging to the illusion of medical detachment, decided to test a theory. He brought in a metronome, a mechanical one, and placed it near Latoya's bed. No explanation, no observation staff, just the device and the girl. For the first 90 seconds, the pendulum ticked steadily at 60 beats per minute. Then, without interference, the rhythm began to shift. Slower, then faster, then irregular. By the 5-minute mark, the pendulum had stopped completely. But the gears were still moving. It was as if time around her bent, not in science fiction theatrics, but in something more terrifying, a quiet defiance of order. That night, Latoya asked Sister Mary Catherine a question that would haunt her the rest of her life. "Do you think souls age?" Sister Mary Catherine hesitated. "In the eyes of God, perhaps." Latoya smiled. "Then he must not see mine." That same evening, Reverend Marsh fell unconscious during his shift and awoke speaking Greek fluently. He hadn't studied Greek since seminary, decades prior. What disturbed him most wasn't that he could speak it, but that he knew it was the wrong dialect for the passage he was quoting. Dr. Brennan had his own nightmare. He saw the Esperanza, the slave ship from the 1823 wreck, floating not on water, but in the sky, upside down. From its hull spilled whispers, names he didn't recognize, except one, Latoya. It echoed until he woke with blood on his sheets from a nosebleed he couldn't explain. At this point, I need to ask you, the listener, a question. If you were born with memories not your own, dreams of places you've never seen, languages your tongue still remembers though you were never taught, would you call it madness, or would you call it inheritance? If you're beginning to understand what this means, comment below. The blood remembers. Say it twice. The blood remembers. To lock in what's waking up inside you. The turning point came on February 11th. That morning, Latoya was found standing at the foot of the chapel altar, barefoot, hands extended, eyes closed. The nurses assumed she was praying until they noticed every candle in the room had been extinguished, and the air smelled not of wax or smoke, but of salt. When asked what she was doing, she simply said, "I'm waiting for the last piece." Later that afternoon, the hospital received an unexpected visitor. A Jesuit priest, Father Elias Moreau, sent from the diocese in Boston. No one had requested him. No letter had been sent. He arrived with only a Bible, a leather satchel, and a sealed letter from Bishop Talbot stating, "This man is not to leave until the girl has been evaluated." Father Moreau was not like the other ministers. He did not pray aloud. He did not quote scripture. He observed, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. He claimed Latoya was not possessed. He said she was containing something or someone. He requested she be moved to the hospital's basement ward, where the original chapel from 1834 had been sealed off due to flood damage. When Dr. Aldrich refused, Father Moreau said a phrase that chilled the entire room. "Then you have already surrendered the upper floors to her will. That night, Topu. Oh, nurses quit without notice." The following morning, the furnace failed again for the first time in weeks, and Latoya was humming. But there was no melody. Just grief. The descent into the basement wasn't physical at first. It began in minds, the quiet corrosion of certainty. Even those who had once dismissed the case as mere hysteria found themselves unable to shake the feeling that something was listening behind the walls. Not watching, listening. Father Moreau was granted access to the sealed lower chapel. The door hadn't been opened in 13 years. The flood that destroyed it in 1834 had rotted much of the wood, and salt deposits still lined the stone floor, but Latoya insisted on being taken there. She pointed to it on a floor map without hesitation. "I was born down there," she whispered, "not the first time. The time that matters." Against protocol, and against Aldrich's better judgment, she was wheeled into the darkness. What happened next is not fully known, but this much is. The attending nurse, Margaret Doyle, left the hospital that night and was later found at the train station 6 towns away, unable to speak, gripping a strip of linen soaked in blood. Father Moreau emerged hours later, drenched in sweat, refusing to answer questions. His palms bore fresh blisters, though no fire had been lit. When Dr. Aldrich finally asked what he'd seen, Moreau looked at him and said, "She carries the memory of something ancient, something we tried to bury in Africa and failed. It lives in bloodlines, not books, and when forgotten, it waits." Over the next 48 hours, Latoya did not eat, drink, or speak. Her heartbeat slowed to 34 beats per minute. Her skin paled, and yet she remained upright, awake, watching. At one point she murmured something that was later translated, not by Dr. Brennan, but by a visiting anthropologist who'd been summoned by Aldrich in desperation. The phrase, "The dead remember the doors we sealed, but the doors do not forget us." That single line unraveled centuries of doctrine. The anthropologist Dr. Isaac Renner traced the language to an obscure West African tongue, one spoken only by a single priestly caste known for conducting death rites involving memory transfer. According to legend, the initiated could pass knowledge between generations, not through stories, but through the body, a spiritual grafting that bound the soul of one ancestor to the flesh of another, a practice the missionaries tried to erase at all costs. Dr. Renner believed Latoya might be the last surviving vessel of this rite, not metaphorically, literally. He proposed a horrifying possibility, that Latoya was not an individual in the conventional sense, but a host, a living manuscript of hundreds of lives bound together by ritual, not reincarnation, not possession, something older, archival memory. The church immediately requested that all further research be halted. The bishop revoked Father Moreau's authority. Dr. Renner was pressured to return to Yale and resign from his post, and Dr. Aldrich received a letter stamped with the seal of the Massachusetts Medical Council. "Discontinue your notes, destroy your casework. This subject is not in alignment with accepted medical inquiry." He didn't comply. He couldn't. Because on February the 14th, Valentine's Day, a day of love, a day of saints, Latoya finally spoke again. She asked for the names of every patient in the hospital, and then, without prompting, she recited the exact day and hour each one had first cried in childhood. When asked how she knew, she responded, "I was there, I remember their mothers. I remember the rooms. I remember the cold hands that carried them. And then she looked up, right at Aldrich, and smiled. I remember you too. The moment she said it, I remember you too. Something inside Dr. Aldrich snapped. Not broke, snapped. The way a locked drawer finally gives after years of pressure from the inside. He didn't sleep that night. He wandered the halls of the infirmary like a man retracing forgotten crimes. Every door he passed, he touched. Every patient he visited, he asked the same question. Do you remember your first cry? Some said yes, some didn't. But more than a few broke down into tears the moment he asked, without knowing why. One young man, recovering from typhoid, began sobbing uncontrollably and gasped, "It was raining, and my mother was already dead. I never knew that before." By morning, Aldrich had filled 3 pages in his journal with memories that weren't his, fragments of lives that felt borrowed, leaked, inherited, like something in the walls had opened and now everything was spilling. He confronted Latoya again. She was calm, barefoot on the cold floor of the observation room, drawing spirals in chalk, spirals that, according to Sister Mary Catherine, matched diagrams once used by ancient priestesses in Ethiopian death rituals, specifically rites meant to bind trauma to a vessel so it wouldn't pass into the next generation. "Why are you doing this?" Aldrich asked her, voice shaking. She didn't answer directly. She looked at the chalk, then up at him and said, "You called me here. Not with your mouth, with your forgetting." That night, Aldrich dreamed of his grandfather, a man who died when he was 10, whispering the names of patients he had never treated. The next morning, Aldrich found a sealed envelope slipped under his study door. No return address. Inside was a faded daguerreotype of a girl standing in front of the burned chapel, the one in the basement. The year written in pencil, 1835. The girl in the image, Latoya, identical, unaged. He showed it to Dr. Brennan. The young doctor turned pale. "That's not possible," he whispered. "She wasn't even found until 1847. Unless she'd never left. Unless the events were not linear, but circular. A kind of spiritual echo. Like the old theories of eternal recurrence, whispered by ancient cultures and echoed later by Nietzsche, that certain souls are fixed points in the wheel of history, reliving versions of the same moment until something is resolved or unleashed. Latoya was no patient. She was a mirror, a reckoning, a boundary marker for where memory ends and myth begins. And once she was crossed, nothing could return to normal. Around this time, the staff began resigning. 3 nurses left within a week. 2 orderlies quit without collecting wages. One of the older physicians, Dr. Howard Griggs, went home early one evening and never returned. His body was found floating in the Mary River days later, clutching a rosary made from human teeth, and through it all, Latoya remained. Not demanding, not violent, just present, as if waiting. If you're still here, still listening, comment this phrase twice. I remember what was never mine. Write it below, speak it aloud, seal it. Because if what's coming next is true, identity itself may not be what you think it is. February 13th, a date that would become known in local law as the Night of Speaking Walls. Though officially it was never recorded, it began just after 2:00 a.m. The night shift nurse, Abigail Martin, was making her rounds when she heard whispers coming from the West Wing, a section with only 3 patients, all heavily sedated. But when she reached the corridor, she found no one speaking. The whispers, she would later claim, were not from people, but from the walls themselves. More precisely, from the bricks. They pulsed like breath. Each whisper pronounced a different name, not those of the living, but names that matched entries from the hospital's earliest death records. Patients who had died before Latoya's arrival, some before the hospital was even completed. Terrified, Abigail fled the corridor and collapsed in Dr. Aldrich's study. But the moment she tried to speak, her mouth froze open, not locked in fear, but in repetition. The same phrase, again and again. "She's not in the hospital. The hospital is in her. Aldrich wrote it down, then crossed it out, then wrote it again, because it felt like a key. A reversal. What if Latoya wasn't occupying space? What if the space was emanating from her? It would explain the physical effects, the temperature changes, the disappearing rats, the sudden recoveries, even the dreams. What they were seeing might not be happening inside the hospital, but inside her proximity, like an inversion of sacred space. The ancients believed in places where the veil between worlds was thin, numinous zones, sacred groves, caves of prophecy. But what if it wasn't the land that was thin, but the soul? What if Latoya was a living threshold? On February the 14th, Valentine's Day, a day meant for love and remembrance, Reverend Blackwood returned for what would be his final visit. He brought a book, an ancient copy of the Liber Dives, a forbidden volume catalogued in the Vatican's suppressed archives, rumored to contain spiritual codes for identifying divine anomalies. The book, Blackwood claimed, had been smuggled out of Rome during the French invasion. He had found references to a woman of the veil, a soul who appears once every generation in moments of great upheaval, not to comfort, but to reveal. Page 237 contained a passage written in a blend of ecclesiastical Latin and Ge'ez. When she comes, the sacred geometry will no longer hold, the corners will bend, time will weep, and the healed will remember the wounds of others. That same afternoon, every clock in the hospital stopped at 3:09 p.m. Every pendulum froze, every watch unwound. Latoya stood by the chapel window, her hands raised as if in prayer. The glass, warped by years of New England frost, began to hum, not a vibration, but a tone, low, subsonic, almost maternal. Dr. Brennan reported that he felt his teeth vibrating inside his skull. Sister Mary Catherine wept openly in the hallway, not from fear, but from recognition. She later said, "That sound. I heard it once before, when I was 7 years old, just before my mother died. She said it was the sound the angels made when they wept for the world. But the angels weren't weeping for us. They were weeping because of us." And the woman at the center of it all, the woman who was never a patient, had just opened a door no one knew was there. A door that was alive. By the third week of February, Blessed Mercy Infirmary had become a place divided, not by walls or doctrine, but by perception. Some believed they were witnessing divine grace. Others whispered they were being tested by something ancient, pre-Christian, and unfathomably cold. But no one believed they were simply caring for a sick woman anymore. Latoya was not a patient. She was a mirror, and what she reflected was the part of each person they most wanted to forget. That's when the phenomenon began to spread beyond the building. Children in the nearby village of Millbrook began waking in the night, crying out in languages their parents didn't recognize. A local blacksmith claimed his daughter, age 4, stood by the fireplace reciting names from his grandfather's war journal, names even he had forgotten. The town priest declared it mass hysteria. But hysteria doesn't cause iron nails to twist into the shape of spirals overnight. Hysteria doesn't cause milk to curdle before it leaves the cow. And hysteria does not explain why 3 of the infirmary's orderlies were found kneeling in the garden one morning, eyes wide open, mouths sewn shut with their own shoelaces, clutching their crucifixes so tightly the metal had embedded into their palms. Dr. Aldrich was unraveling. The lines on his face deepened. He stopped writing in his medical journals and started sketching instead. Strange symbols that resembled crop patterns, concentric circles intersected by broken crosses. He began to wear gloves indoors, claimed his skin had started to remember things his mind didn't want to. When Dr. Brennan asked him what he meant, Aldrich simply said, "She doesn't teach, she reminds." Meanwhile, Latoya's demeanor remained calm, serene even. She continued her quiet participation in prayers, her stillness during examinations, her polite nods at the nuns, but her presence was unmistakable, heavy, like fog, made of thought. On February 20th, Sister Mary Catherine made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She brought Latoya to the hospital's basement. Officially, it was to retrieve linens. Unofficially, it was to test a theory. You see, the basement hadn't been used in over a decade. Local superstition held that the land it rested on had been cursed long before the hospital was built. Native tribes avoided it. The original architect quit the project halfway through construction, citing dreams of burning trees and eyes without heads. But Catherine believed that whatever Latoya was, whatever she carried, it would react to the forgotten. They descended alone, and in that lightless chamber, beneath pipes and old prayer stools, Latoya stopped walking. Then she whispered something. The nun's account would later be sealed in a Vatican file marked non recitare, never to be spoken. But her final sentence before leaving the order was this. She said the basement remembered her. It was no longer a hospital. It was a house of memory. And Latoya had come home. Now, if you're still here, comment the phrase, "I remember the basement." Write it twice, not for the algorithm, for your identity. Because if you're beginning to feel that this isn't just a story, if it's starting to feel like a return, then you're already further down the path than most ever go. We continue. If you're brave enough. 3 days after Sister Mary Catherine's descent into the basement, she vanished. No note, no witnesses, no luggage missing, only her rosary laid neatly atop her empty cot, its crucifix twisted backward as if something had turned it in upon itself. The Vatican sent no inquiry, but a man in a black cassock with no known parish arrived the next evening, requested her personal effects, and left without a word. The staff pretended not to see him. The nuns refused to speak of him, and Reverend Whitmore, when asked, simply said, "She was never meant to go down there." Dr. Aldrich had stopped sleeping entirely. He'd taken up residence in the chapel, sitting beneath the stained glass depiction of the resurrection, sketching symbols into the pews with a bone-handled scalpel. The chapel lights would flicker when Latoya passed by, even when unlit. The crucifix above the altar began to darken at the base, as if scorched by an unseen heat. But it was Dr. Brennan, ever the rationalist, who made the final push into madness. He had taken it upon himself to transcribe the phrases Latoya spoke in her unknown tongue. Dozens of them, captured phonetically in his journals, passed through translation software and the linguistic filters of 3 professors at Harvard. One phrase repeated more than any other. Naku zai dom ayen. It appeared on the day Latoya arrived. It appeared during Mrs. Hitchcock's visions. It appeared scrawled in ash across the hospital fireplace mantel on the morning of Sister Catherine's disappearance. And finally, Brennan decoded it. It wasn't a phrase. It was a name that predates the Bible, that predates Babylon. A name found only once, in a forbidden page of the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, burned by Christian censors in 1451. Nakuzai, translated loosely, the keeper of echoes. Not a demon, not a god, something in between. Not a force that creates, but one that collects. Collects pain, collects memory, collects fragments of soul left behind when humans suffer in silence. And Latoya was its vessel, its remembering place, its voice in flesh. That night, 3 patients died in their sleep, not from illness, from silence. Each was found with eyes wide, mouths open, faces frozen in expressions not of fear, but awe. As if they had seen the truth and could not bear its beauty, Dr. Aldrich, standing over the 3rd body, whispered, "We're not healing them. She is, but not how we think." And with that, he began preparations for the ritual. Yes, a ritual. A man of science, now drawing pentagrams in salt on the floor of his examination room. He claimed it wasn't superstition, but protocol. He referenced texts older than Hippocrates. He called it a diagnostic of the soul. Latoya never resisted. She watched him, as if waiting for him to finally see. The ritual was set for the night of the 29th, a leap day that didn't exist on the calendar, but somehow felt fated, and that night would change everything. not just for the hospital, but for history itself. The chapel doors were bolted shut, the windows boarded from the inside. Only 5 men stood within the sanctum of Blessed Mercy that night, each one sworn to secrecy by blood and by fear. Dr. Aldrich, trembling but resolute, led the rite. Reverend Whitmore stood across from him, palms clenched tight around a Bible that hadn't been opened in days. Its pages had begun to blacken at the edges. He hadn't noticed. Dr. Brennan, his hair now graying from weeks of sleepless study, had drawn the circle. Salt, ash, and crushed myrrh marked the border between the known and the forbidden. It wasn't meant to protect. It was meant to contain. Latoya stood at the center, eyes closed, silent. She hadn't spoken a word since the night the crucifix burned. Beside her, on a wooden table meant for communion, lay the brass locket she arrived with, opened for the first time. Inside, a tightly folded piece of vellum. No writing, only a perfect black fingerprint pressed in the center, smudgeless, timeless, human, and not. Dr. Aldrich raised the old physician's ledger in his hands, reading aloud from the final notes he'd compiled. Though he no longer understood the language he was speaking, his voice shook, the syllables tasting foreign in his mouth, as if dredged from the marrow of the earth itself. The air thickened. The chapel lights flickered, then died. But the locket began to glow, not with fire, not with light, with memory. And then Latoya opened her eyes. They weren't human anymore, not possessed, not monstrous, just ancient. Windows into something that had witnessed the first betrayal, something that knew what Eve saw when she turned from the garden and what Cain heard before he raised the stone. She spoke just one word: remember. And in that moment, every man in that room did. Dr. Brennan collapsed, weeping, muttering names he couldn't possibly know, his ancestors, his descendants, lives he had never lived but could now feel, each one pulsing through him like electricity. Reverend Whitmore dropped the Bible. It hit the ground and split open, not at Psalms, not at Revelation, but at a blank page in the back that began to bleed. His lips moved in prayer, but no sound came out, and Dr. Aldrich saw it all, like a film burning in reverse. He saw every patient he had ever failed, every lie wrapped in compassion, every prayer offered not for healing, but control. He saw what medicine was always afraid to admit, that the soul could fracture in ways no scalpel could mend. He dropped the ledger, and Latoya stepped out of the circle. The salt scattered, the ash dispersed. The myrrh caught flame, but the fire did not burn. Instead, it revealed, etched into the chapel walls, beneath the plaster, behind the paint, symbols long hidden beneath centuries of Christian sanctimony, glyphs, maps, instructions for remembrance, not for salvation. Latoya turned to the men. She smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, but knowingly. "I am not the illness," she whispered. "I am the wound made visible." And then she was gone. Not vanished, not spirited away. Simply not there anymore. The locket clattered shut. The lights returned. The men stood alone, changed, broken open, made whole. No one spoke of that night again, but each would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had remembered. 17 days after Latoya's disappearance, Blessed Mercy Infirmary shuttered its doors. Officially, it was due to structural instability from winter damage. But no records show any inspections, no repairs were ever ordered, and no one in town recalled a single storm that year strong enough to do harm. The real reason was simpler and far more disturbing. The building had become quiet. Not peaceful, not abandoned. Quiet, in the way that places feel when something still watches from the walls. Dr. Aldrich left Massachusetts without notice, never returning to medicine. He died 3 years later in Louisiana under a false name, leaving behind only a single object: the sealed brass locket, mailed anonymously to a university library in Boston with a note that read, "Do not open unless you wish to remember." They never did. Reverend Whitmore retired from the ministry, citing irreconcilable spiritual doubts. His final sermon went unrecorded, though witnesses described it as an hour of silence and weeping. He disappeared weeks later. Some say they saw him wandering the forest west of Millbrook, whispering to the trees. Dr. Brennan remained the only one willing to speak, but only through code. In obscure academic journals and arcane footnotes, he embedded pieces of Latoya's dialect, fragments of a language that didn't officially exist. He died in 1901, surrounded by pages of translations no one could fully decipher. And as for the patients, the ones who shared her presence, who dreamed her dreams, most recovered, some vanished. A few, like Mrs. Hitchcock, lived lives of strange lucidity, recalling impossible memories until their final breath. Her last words, according to her daughter, were, "She helped me find him again." In 1923, during renovations for a new seminary, workers demolished the remains of Blessed Mercy. Beneath the chapel foundation they found, and what should never have been there, a burial site far older than the building itself. The bones were arranged in a circular pattern. Charcoal markings surrounded the grave, not in English nor Latin, but in the same glyphs recorded in Aldrich's journal. One of the workers touched the brass plate embedded in the central stone. He lost consciousness for 13 minutes. When he awoke, he spoke in perfect Haitian Creole, a language he had never learned. He remembered the ocean. He remembered fire. He remembered chains. But most of all, he remembered a name, Latoya. This story was never covered by newspapers, never studied by historians. It exists in whispers, in unmarked boxes, in journal margins and chapel shadows. But it exists. And now, you carry it, not as a tale to repeat, but as a truth to bear. Because stories like this aren't just stories, they are echoes of a forgotten structure, a deeper system, one designed to erase anything that dares to awaken the part of you that remembers who you really are. So if you've made it this far, if you've felt something ancient stirring beneath the surface, prove it. Comment the phrase "I remember" below twice. Once for who you were before, and once for who you can never be again, because they will try to make you forget the institutions, the dogmas, the polished lies dressed as mercy. But you heard it, you saw it, and now, so do they. Keep your eyes open. The story of Latoya is over, but the remembering has just begun. If this shook something loose in you, don't scroll. Comment, "I remember" twice below. Once for the man you were, once for the man they tried to erase. Subscribe if you're done being blind.